Hello there and welcome to my guide for painting the Marcel Crisis Protocol Weapon X Program Rivals set. As you can see, I've sprayed both characters with some matte white spray from Colourforge, and everything else I've sprayed with matte black spray from Colourforge. Starting with Logan, I'm going to paint his jeans with some Thunderhawk blue, which I'll then give a wash with some Drakenhof Nightshade. For Sabretooth's combats, I'm going to use some Death Guard green. These will receive a wash with some Athonian camo shade. Once the wash is dried on Logan, I'm going to relayer the Thunderhawk blue, making sure I avoid any of the recesses. And this will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Thunderhawk blue and matte white for the highlights. Moving back to Sabretooth, once again I'm going to relayer the Death Guard green, avoiding any of the recesses. And the first highlight for that will be a 50-50 mix of Death Guard green and matte white. And this will be followed by the same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio. For the shirts, I'm then going to paint that with Grey Seer. I'm also going to use it to paint the fur on Sabretooth's cuffs and collar. And then I'm going to highlight the shirts with a 50-50 mix of matte white and Grey Seer. And on the collar and cuffs, I'm going to use a quick dry brush, but using the same mix. After that, I'm just going to use matte white just by itself for the shirt. And then once again, I'll dry brush it onto the collar and cuffs. Then I want to paint Sabretooth's boots, the straps around his legs, his belt, and he's got a little bandana. I'm going to paint those all with a Baden black. There's also a part on Wolverine as well, on his hat, on the rim of his hat as well. And all that will then get washed with some Nuln Oil. For Wolverine's belt and jacket, I'm going to use some Dryad bark. And I'll give that a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. Once the wash on the black is dry, I'm going to highlight that with some Corvus Black. And this will be followed by a second highlight of Eshin Grey. Then for Sabretooth's coat, I'm going to paint that with some XV88, which I'll then give a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. Moving back to Logan's jacket, I'm going to use a 70-30 mix of Dryad Bark and Gothor Brown for the first highlight. And then this will be followed by that same mix, but at a 50-50 ratio. As for Sabretooth's jacket, I'm going to relayer the XV88, taking care to avoid any of the recesses. And this will be followed by a 70-30 mix of XV88 and Tau Light Ochre for the first highlight. The second will be the same mix, but at a 50-50 ratio. And then once again the same mix, but at a 70-30 ratio in favour of Tau Light Ochre. With their clothes mostly out of the way, I'm going to move on to their skin, and I'm going to use some Bugman's Glow. And this will then receive a wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. Once that wash has dried, I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to paint the eye. This will be followed by matte white. And then finally Abaddon Black again for the pupil. With the eyes out of the way, we're going to move on to the skin, and we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone. This will be followed by Cadian Flesh Tone just by itself. Then a 50-50 mix of Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh. And then finally Kislev Flesh just by itself, but this is mostly focused on things like the edge of the knuckles, noses and things like that. Now I'm going to finish off Wolverine's jacket with some Wraithbone for the collar. I'm going to paint his hat with some Morghast Bone. I'm also going to use it to paint the claws on Sabretooth along with the teeth around his neck. Then I'm going to use Xandri Dust to paint Sabretooth's hair. And I'm going to use some Morfang Brown to paint Wolverine's shoes. Then all these areas from the Wraithbone will be washed with some Army Painter soft tone. While that wash dries, I'm going to paint Logan's belt buckle with some Retributor armor. And I'll give that a quick wash with some Reichland Flesh Shade. Next, I'll use some Abaddon Black to paint his hair. And then I'm going to use some Iron Hand Steel to paint his claws and the belt buckle on Sabretooth. I'll then wash the black and the silver with some Nuln Oil. Once the wash is dried on the collar, I'm then going to use some Wraithbone just to dab it on to create a little bit of a pattern. So take your time and be very gentle with the brush. I'm then going to use a 50-50 mix of Morghast Bone and Wraithbone to start highlighting the hat. And this will be followed by the same mix but at a 80-20 ratio in favour of Wraithbone. I'm also going to use that mix for Sabretooth's claws and the teeth around his neck. I'm then going to use Wraithbone on the very tips of the claws and the necklace for the highlight. For the silver, I'll use a 50-50 mix of Iron Hand Steel and Stormhost Silver, followed by a second highlight of Stormhost Silver just by itself. To highlight the belt buckle, I'm going to use some Liberator Gold. For Wolverine's shoes, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown. This will of course be followed by Scrag Brown just by itself for the final highlight. For Sabretooth's hair, we're going to use a 50-50 mix of Xandri Dust and Ushabti Bone. This of course will be followed by Ushabti Bone just by itself for the final highlight. We're going to leave both their bases alone for now while we work on the diorama, because some of the colours we're going to use for the diorama are going to be used for this base, so we might as well do those at the same time. So, starting with the actual terrain piece itself, I'm going to be using an airbrush. If you don't have an airbrush, you can still paint this thing by hand. It'll just take a little bit longer. So I'm going to use a sort of mid-tone grey, it's pretty much Dawnstone effectively, and I'm going to spray the entire piece of all the concrete and the rocks sort of surrounding it. For the rocks, however, I'm going to be a little bit lighter. I don't want them to be as light as the actual concrete, so I'm going to make sure that that's a very thin coat that I give it, so the grey is a lot darker. If you're not using an airbrush and you just use a standard brush, I'd suggest using some Mechanica Standard Grey for this part and Dawnstone for the concrete. For the concrete, I'm going to give it a couple more of coats with the grey to make the actual colour a lot brighter and so it stands out a lot more. And then for a highlight, I'm going to use a tiny bit of white just to do the edges and the edges of any cracks. If you're using a brush, just give the edges a dry brush with some grey cere. Now the rest of the concrete is out of the way, I'm going to dry brush the rocks with some grey cere, but I'm going to do it very, very lightly and making sure I only pick out the edges and the finer details. The reason why I'm doing this is because I will be adding a wash later, but before I do that, I need to paint all of the metal parts. Next, I'm going to use some Iron Warriors to start painting the metal areas on the bunker. I'm also going to use it to paint the spare bases that you get, the ones that basically are used to cover the holes when the miniatures aren't there. And of course, we're also going to use it to paint the bases of the miniatures themselves. Next, we're going to use some Iron Hand Steel to paint the antenna, and we're going to use it to also paint the majority of the bike. Next, going to use some Dryad Bark to paint the pouches that are on the back of the bike. And then I'm going to use some Abaddon Black to start painting the chevrons on the door and on the floor of the terrain piece. Then we'll give all the metallics, the Dryad Bark and the Abaddon Black a wash with some Nuln Oil. Once that wash is dried, we're then going to give the terrain piece and the metallics another wash, but this time with some watered down Agrax Earthshade. Once you've let those washes dry, we're going to start working on the metal. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to dry brush all of the Iron Warriors with some Iron Hand Steel. Then to brighten things up a little bit more, we're going to use a second dry brush, this time with some Stormhost Silver. Next, we're going to use some Dryad Bark to paint all of the wood, and Sandry Dust to paint the inner bark. Don't forget to paint the branches that are on the little bases and on Sabretooth as well. Then we'll give all that wood a wash with some Agrax Earthshade. Once that wash is dried, we're going to use some Gothor Bran to give the wood a dry brush. And then we'll follow that up with a second dry brush of Baneblade Bran. For the inner bark, we're going to dry brush that with some Ushabti Bone. Then we're going to go back to the pouches on the bike, and we're going to quickly give those an edge highlight with some Gothor Bran. I'm then going to use some grey Sear to start painting all of the snow on the terrain piece and the bases. And then we're going to do quite a heavy stippling onto that snow with some matte white. I'm also going to use matte white to paint the keyboard on the inside of the door and any lights. For the keyboard and lights, I'm going to give them a quick coat of Iyanden Yellow. And the interior light, I'm going to use some Flesh Tearers Red. Next, I'm going to use some Avalanche Sunset to paint the other part of the chevrons. And this area will then get a wash with some Army Painter Soft Tone. Finally, to add some rust effects onto the model, I'm going to water down a little bit of Mournfang Brown and just dab at areas where I think there'd be rust. Finally, there's a skull on this base. If you glued it on, I think it was an actual optional extra, and I'm going to start painting that with some Morghast Bone. This will be followed by a 50-50 mix of Morghast Bone and Wraithbone. And then lastly, Wraithbone just by itself for the final highlight. I'm then going to paint the little roll-up that's on the bike with some Deathguard Green. And I'm going to wash that with some Agrax Earthshade. And then finally, I'm going to use a little bit of Abaddon Black to paint the rims of both Wolverine and Sabretooth. And there we are, that's the set finished. I have to say, it's an absolute blast painting it. I'm not a big fan of painting large terrain pieces, but this was quite enjoyable to do, and the models that actually come with it are really nice. Because of the sheer size of it though, it took around about 15 hours to complete. But that was mostly working on the terrain piece. The actual models themselves will be a lot quicker to do. They only took around about 4 hours for the pair. If you followed this guide, I really do hope you found it useful. And if you want to see more, give the channel a subscribe, the video a thumbs up, and I will see you on the next one. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.